Sorry, guys. The dogs were barking. Okay. I was merely relieved that an accident had been averted. Two men behind us were talking seriously about the huge wake a ship like the Titanic created simply by moving her bulk through the water, and how anything in her path would be helpless in the face of that suction. As she tends to be so nervous, I would have expected Mrs. Carstairs to be extremely upset about our near miss. But she was chatting casually with the woman on her left and discussing mutual acquaintances, of which they seemed to have many. We were underway now, but other than a slight sense of engines throbbing somewhere far below me, I could barely feel the ship's motion. Excuse me. Since I had been dreading constant bobbing and lurching, this smooth and gentle pace came as a relief. A bugle began trumpeting so close to us that I jumped. It was being played by a man in a crisp blue uniform with brass buttons. All around me, almost everyone began to move away from the railings and head back inside. "Come along now, Margie J," Mrs. Carstairs said briskly. "Time for our luncheon." And from this, I gathered that it was routine for the sound of a bugle, which is kind of like a trumpet, to announce meals. This was far preferable to the forceful banging on tin pots I had heard so many times during my childhood. It is also routine on board to call the midday meal luncheon and evening meal dinner. Margie J., do all Americans have a penchant for misbegotten nicknames, or is it just Mrs. Carstairs? A vulgar habit, to my way of thinking. Then I heard another American lady up ahead of us happily greeting someone else by shouting, "Bootsy, how are you?" Bootsy? God save us from the colonies. The first-class dining saloon was on D deck. We waited in a crush of people for a lift and then rode downstairs. There was a large, inviting reception room in front of us, and a small band was playing off to one side. I did not recognize the tune, but it was very cheery. The reception room was filled with wicker chairs surrounded by small round tables and an array of large reedy plants that had been placed in strategic locations. It struck me as a cozy place to linger. The dining saloon itself ran the full width of the ship and seemed even longer. The room looked as though it could easily serve several hundred people, and yet the small, elegant tables had somehow an intimate feel. The ceilings curved into detailed moldings and were supported here and there by thin white columns. A plush patterned carpet covered the floor, and the tall frosted windows made it seem as though we were any place but aboard a ship. These are great visualizations. The detail's really good. You can picture in your mind that when you're there. It was not my place to take any initiative, so I sat in the chair Mrs. Carstairs indicated. It had a solid feel and a sturdy oaken arms and legs and medium green upholstery. At least two people my size could have fit in this seat, and I felt rather young and small perched on its edge. If I were not careful, I feared that I might slide right off. It was a chair designed to comfort the corpulent, I suspected. The tablecloths were white, and a small lamp with a dark red shade sat in the middle of the table as a centerpiece. A napkin was folded like a pair of wings atop each plate and accompanied by a daunting array of glassware and cutlery. Sister Catherine had advised me always to mimic whatever the most mannerly person at the table seemed to be doing, and I can only hope that that technique will carry me through. Our table seated 6, and shortly we were joined by Mr. and Mrs. Prescott, whom Mrs. Carstairs was delighted to see. She introduced me in the briefest possible way, and then they were off in an energetic conversation about the spring fashions, the delight of the Russian ballet, and an endless stream of people I did not know and places I had never been. Even if I had felt bold enough to participate in the conversation, I would have had nothing to contribute to these topics. The Prescotts were pleasant to me, but expressed great disappointment. The Mrs. Carstairs the Mrs. Carstairs had been unable to make the voyage. Mr. Carstairs, excuse me. Mrs. Carstairs had concurred, then they began to speak of Broadway and the West End and other theatrical subjects. Bangers and mash would have done me nicely, but our luncheon was far more impressive than that, with multiple courses. I elected not to drink any wine and satisfied myself with water instead. A cold potato soup, salmon, tiny spring peas, crisp asparagus with tart dressing, roasted meats, a stream of black-jacketed waiters bearing silver platters appeared at our table again and again. I generally prefer the heartier taste of mutton, but my sliced lamb was delicious. For that matter, everything right down to the fruit tart and array of cheeses and fruits that were offered for dessert, was delicious. After our meal, I was ready for a bit of lie down myself, so I was pleased when Mrs. Carstairs suggested returning to our cabins. In our absence, her flowers had been arranged. There was even a bouquet of yellow daffodils in my room. Our clothing had also been unpacked and the luggage stowed away. "Fairies came to visit, eh?" I said. Mrs. Carstairs laughed. "Oh, child, it is quite customary." An enchanting custom, I should say. My washstand had been well supplied with thick towels and small scented soaps. After a mite of freshening up, I lay up on my bed for a time, marveling once again at how I could scarcely tell that the ship was moving. Even the hum of the engines had begun to seem familiar and not loud enough to be oppressive. It was just after 3, according to the small clock in my room, when I went to take Florence for a walk and ultimately ended up here on the promenade, lounging on a deck chair. Yet another steward even brought me a steamer rug to tuck about my legs so I would not get chilled, like a blanket. I have been sitting here writing for a while, then pausing to watch people stroll by. A number of children have been playing on the deck, tended by governesses for the most part, as well as the occasional parent. A governess is like a nanny. The children have tops and marbles and other small toys, too numerous to mention. Except for 1 or 2 stormy bouts of tears, they all seem to have a happy afternoon. Part of me would like to go over and join in, but as a hired companion, I do not suppose I am permitted to engage in childish pursuits on this trip. At one point, a ball rolled in my direction, and I tossed it back to the boy who owned it. Even though he was probably only a year or 2 younger than I am, he just said, "Thank you, miss," and raced off to continue his game. I cannot help feeling a little bit left out. Too old to play with the children, too young and naive to interact with the adults. In these fancy clothes, I can pass for one of them. But to me, the differences in our social backgrounds feel too huge to overcome. I suppose I should have a driving desire to examine the ship from top to bottom, but so far, I would rather adjust gradually to being here. There will be plenty of time for exploration in the days to come. But now I think Florence could do with stretching her small legs, so I will write more later. Okay. Let's see this next part. All right, so that is Wednesday, April 10th. So that was the first day they started out on the ship. The next reading will be about April 11th, which is about, what? I think I missed some pages. Actually, we'll read this first part. Thursday, April 11th, 1912. RMS Titanic. I had every intention of continuing my entry last night, but fell asleep almost before I had the chance to lie down. The sea air can do that, Mrs. Carstairs tells me. We stopped in Cherbourg, France last night, and more passengers boarded the ship. The water was not deep enough for us to steam all the way in, so smaller boats brought the passengers out and transferred them aboard. Tenders, those boats are called. I am not sure why. I would like now to be able to claim that I have been to France, but sitting quite some distance from ashore does not really count, I suppose. I saw the coast at least. This morning we were en route to Queenstown, Ireland. I hoped we docked close enough to be able to see the land of my father's birth. It would be even better if we were able to disembark, so I could touch the soil of my ancestors, but that seems doubtful. Robert knocked on my door early this morning and then brought in tea, scones, marmalade, and a perfect little bunch of grapes. He stayed to talk for a few moments, and I found out that this is his first job as a full-fledged steward, as opposed to being an assistant, and that he was very excited to have been assigned to first class. Well, duh. It's the nicest one. A strange thing happened yesterday, I told him, indicating the cheerful vase on my bedside table. Elves came and brought me a gift. They must have liked your smile, Miss Brady, he said with a grin. Then a bell rang in the stateroom somewhere down the hall, and he had to leave to answer it. I ate every bite of the food he had brought, yet still had no trouble eating full breakfast in the dining saloon later. Perhaps the sea air makes one hungry, too? Not that having a large appetite is unusual for me, mind you. After breakfast, Mrs. Carstairs thought it would be nice to spend an hour or 2 in the first-class writing room, which is next to the lounge. Queenstown will be our last opportunity to post letters before we arrive in New York. Quite a few other passengers seemed to have had the same idea, but we were able to find an empty desk and 2 chairs without much difficulty. There are lots of postcards and fancy vellum stationery available for the passengers to use. The top of the stationery is the same red flag with the white star logo that I've seen on many other items, like menus, matchbooks on the ship. Next to the logo is printed, "On board RMS Titanic." I am tempted to slip a few sheets into this diary to keep as a souvenir. I wonder if anyone would mind me doing so. I'll ask Robert maybe later and if it would be all right, but I am hoping he and I will be friends, as I do not feel at all shy talking to him. I wrote fairly detailed letters about the trip to William and Sister Catherine, then worked on a simpler note to Nora. She cannot read yet, but I printed neatly in the hope that she might enjoy practicing. Then I wasted several sheets of stationery trying to draw an accurate picture of the ship for her to hang by her bed. I began to get frustrated at my lack of even minimal artistic competence and crumbled one of the sheets so loudly that several people in the room looked up. Mrs. Carstairs was mortified by this unexpected attention, which I attempted to divert by looking around too, as though I were searching for the crumpling culprit. A broad-shouldered man with kind, clean-shaven features stopped next to our desk. I noticed him walking around, seemingly observing everyone for about 20 minutes. He must have noticed my sketching struggles. He leaned over and examined my discarded drawings before I had time to cover them with my hand. My face felt hot with embarrassment, as they truly were inept. "Please excuse my disruption," I said. "I am trying to send a picture to a little girl of whom I am terribly fond." He smiled and said he would be happy to put together a quick diagram for me, if I would like. I thanked him, but explained that to Nora, my having drawn the ship myself would mean more to her than the quality of the rendering. "Ah," he said, "well, in that case, may I suggest that you angle the funnels more? Then just try for very clean lines. Long strokes instead of attempting so much detail." I gave that a try, and my next effort showed some small improvement. "There you go," he said. "Think you'll do very nicely now." I thanked him again, then he said, "Good day, ladies," and went on his way. "My goodness, that was Mr. Andrews," Mrs. Carstairs said in an awed voice once he was gone. "A nice fellow," I agreed, drawing intently. "He designed the ship," she said. Startled, I stopped drawing. "Then I guess he would have done quite an accurate illustration," I said finally. Mrs. Carstairs shook her head, seeming exasperated. "You are a most curious child, MJ." "MJ. I thank you, Mrs. Upstairs," I said. "A very difficult child," she said, sounding much more exasperated. I nodded, sadly, and we both returned to our letters. Okay, so we're going to stop there. It'll start again later in the day on April 11th. So until next time, hope you guys are enjoying.